Late today, I spoke with former Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett, and as usual, he didn't hold back. Jeff Kennett, it is a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for your time. I'm largely winging this with you because I think you're probably going to surprise me with some of your answers. I can't quite pick what you'll say to some of them, but I know you haven't been a fan of state border closures throughout this pandemic, but I am assuming that you think closing the Victorian-New South Wales border under the current circumstances makes sense. Do you?
I do, Tracy. The situation down here is developing quite seriously, and I can quite understand every other state and territory now closing their borders. The sadness about it is it restricts travel, but it also restricts our ability to regrow the economy as quickly as possible.
What effect do you think this is having on Victorians? I mean, and I guess psychologically, because I know that that's a key interest for you.
I think in the last 24 hours since this new lockdown has been declared, the emotions run from acceptance through to anger and also depression. So the generalised view is one of profound sadness, and the depression is coming from those small retailers I've spoken to, not only just coffee bars, but restaurants and shops who were thinking they were going to reopen and have reopened to some degree, are now going to have to close again. And they have struggled desperately since late January, early February, and many of them are now simply wondering whether they're going to be able to, or is it worth trying to stay open.
Because Victoria acted hard and acted fast in the early days of this pandemic, sort of back in March when everything was shutting down, and Dan Andrews copped a lot of criticism for some of his decisions. You know, schools, for example, that was a hot debate. So Victorians probably were justified in thinking that the hard stuff was behind them.
Well, I guess that's correct. There's been two incidents in particular where the government has failed. One has been over the Cedar Meats incident, which was not called out quickly enough, and 90 cases have come from that. This was a meatworks which were donors to the Labor Party, and I suspect many of their employees unwittingly have probably been caught up in this move by the Labor Party to stack branches. But the worst one, of course, was the failure over the quarantine of the hotels for new arrivals. And that has been a shambolic performance by government. And sadly, that has led to many more clusters and is mainly responsible for the situation we find ourselves in today.
It's certainly been a terrible failure. Do you think that Victorians want names named and people shamed now, or do you think that they're willing to wait for the results of the inquiry?
Tracy, that's an interesting question. I suspect most Victorians, and a lot that I've spoken to today of all ages, are very cross because the way in which the Premier is presenting to the public, he's almost, through his language, blaming them. So people are angry. In terms of calling for heads, it's not the appropriate time for that. We've got to address now trying to get the spread of this coronavirus under control. But you might remember the Premier established an inner cabinet of 7 other ministers to handle this particular event. No other government has done it. It was a PR exercise only. But now that he's established that inner cabinet, this gang of 8, they have failed. And they have failed dismally. Just think, in Victoria, no bars, no restaurants, tourism facilities closed, and those venues provide so many of our young not only with part-time jobs while at school and after school, but permanent jobs. So how are we going to actually be able to give hope to our young that quickly they're going to find employment that is worthy of the skills they have?
I want to talk to you in a moment more about the rebuilding of the economy, but I'd also like your insight because you are a former Premier of Victoria. You know what it's like to run a state. And politically...
Last century.
It was a long time ago, I know, but, you know, I remember. I'm one of the few who still remembers. But politically, it's always very popular in these situations to call for the head of the minister. But I'm curious about operationally. Operationally, do ministers or even the Premier micromanage things like the letting of contracts, training, protocols, staffing in a massive operation like the hotel quarantine operation? Or does that come down to department heads? And is it department heads that we need to be looking at and pointing the finger at?
Well, there's already been a few shuffles among the bureaucracy. And, you know, in my day and under the Westminster tradition, the buck always stopped with the politicians. You accepted responsibility for what your people did. This government has never accepted any responsibility for the way in which they've disregarded the public interest. So we have a cultural problem here in Victoria with the quality of the government who were elected to serve us, but who only stand to serve their own interests. So that's why I say I'm not calling for the heads of anyone right now. Right now isn't the moment. Let's focus on what we have to do. But my goodness, out of sheer self-decency, those 8, that gang of 8, should resign. They should all resign en masse. They have failed this state, and their legacy is going to be felt for years as we try and rebuild.
I wouldn't expect you to say anything else but that, because you're a former Liberal Premier. But moving away from the politics of it, and I understand what you say about the politics, why do you think, what we haven't had is a clear answer to why Daniel Andrews decided to go for private security and not the Defence Force and police to manage hotel quarantine? We haven't had that answer. Why do you think he did that?
Well, because they're covering up. Now, please, I'm not making my comments as a Liberal or a former Premier. I'm making them just as a citizen of the state of Victoria. And the reason they're not answering the questions that your colleagues in the media are consistently asking is because what Daniel has done, as he's done before, he's appointed a former judge to hold an inquiry. So every time one of these ministers is asked, why have you, or why has anyone done anything that has led us to this point, they simply say, we've now established an inquiry, it's not appropriate for us to answer your question. That's a cover-up, an absolute cover-up. And the Victorians deserve more, and so do people around the rest of Australia. This isn't just about Victoria. This is about the economic and social welfare of the country. We represent about 25% of the population. And we are going to damage the Prime Minister and the Treasurer's opportunity to rebuild this country as quickly as possible. We'll feel the impact here more. So please, I know you'll think my comments are political. They're not. They're just common sense. We need a standard of decency and the highest standards of governance.
Let me ask you a hypothetical question. You are Premier of Victoria right now. What would you be doing right now?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be able to talk to the public in a manner which gives them confidence that they believe that what you're doing is right, and come out and say, we've fouled up. We've made a lot of mistakes.
He has
and we'll
said the
address
buck
those
stops
in
with
due
him.
course.
He has said that, though, hasn't he?
Oh, no, he hasn't. No, he has not. Please, you've got to believe me. There has been no accepting of any responsibility by any of these ministers. But you ask me what I would do. If the public are not confident in their leaders, then the opportunity of rebuilding the economy or addressing this outbreak is very much reduced. So confidence is everything, more important than anything else. They've got to believe that their leaders are taking we, the public, into their confidence, answering the questions, telling the truth and not protecting their own backsides.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Have a very good evening in New South Wales.
And around the rest of the country, that was former Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett.